I spent the past 100 days developing a game from this, to this, to this, and releasing it on Steam where you can play it right now. But why? You see, I've felt like such a fraud for starting and stopping like a dozen projects over the past few years. Just look at my channel. So, I'm going to teach you everything that I learned in 100 days in only
21
minutes and show you the biggest mistakes I made along the way so that you can avoid them. Now, there are 5 main points that you need to take away from this video. The first being to start with a clear deadline and a realistic scope. I came up with a timeline of an MVP in 1 month, live demo in 3, and then releasing it in 6. So currently we are at month 3. It is released on Steam. You can go play it right now. And we are right on schedule. I had originally had plans for this grand multiplayer game with all these cool features and mashup of 4 different genres and remaking Skyrim and blah, 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 blah. I didn't want to do a long project because if you've seen any of the game development news lately, Unity has been a thing. So I wanted a scope where I could start and finish a game. By the way, so what am I even making here? Well, here's the core concept. Tower defense, roguelike elements. That's it. That's the whole theme. Heavily inspired by games like Kingdom Rush, but with some roguelike elements from games that I love to play like Slay the Spire. I also love games like Kingdoms and Castles, and originally wanted to make this a city builder as well, but I wound up dropping that, and there's a really good reason why. Which brings us into point 4, which is to rescope often. I broke down my tasks into goals for each month, for each week, for each session. Subnote, actually like sitting down and writing out what I was going to do before I sat down at my computer made a huge difference. It allowed me to collect my thoughts and not immediately start scrolling Reddit or Twitter. Also, people want to play both of these games. Their genres are very popular on Steam. Also something I want to make. So with all of that lined up, jumping immediately into the first week of development, I started by setting up some initial procedural generation of the island. I really loved writing code for the cave generation using an irregular grid. That was done using a generation technique called wave function collapse. If you want a video on how to do that, this video goes greatly into detail on it. I built that on top of the cave game idea that I had by applying wave function collapse on top of an irregular grid. With this and a new mesh deformation skill unlocked, I applied it to these pre-made cave meshes, and again, if you want to see how I did that, whole video going over it. But building on top of that, I spent the first week refactoring it to work with spawning these little hexagons. I rewrote the logic to allow the outer vertices to stay strict with hard edges or relax. I don't know which I'll go with, I'll figure it out later. I did a lot of refactoring of the old code to make it more efficient. I needed to create a base for the island, and after that I ran a lot, and I mean a lot, of different tests. I wound up spawning a bunch of points, got the ones inside the points, used some magic called Delaney triangulation to create a mesh that's connected. Once we got that and the base mesh generation rolling, I moved on to creating a height map, the lower mesh. Also, I added all these noise controls and added a fall off map so that it can be larger towards the center of the island. Also added border spawning, spawn around tiles and corners. I spent some time making a video about the Unity situation in Godot, which really lit a fire under my ass about wanting to finish this game. I felt like an armchair game developer as I have no released game and no credentials, but you know what I do have? Coffee, and you know what that makes? Rivers. Moving on to week 3, it was time to add some rivers to the tiles, so I wrote some code to use wave function collapse to spawn connecting rivers until they make it to a border tile in which they become a little waterfall. One thing I do want to point out is that I'm constantly going back to old code and rewriting, refactoring it. So then I set up some more river prefabs for lakes and T intersections, like hey, a T just like TJ. If you guys want some lore, the T stands for tired and the J stands for just kill me now. I don't know why there are so many ponds that look like sheep. There are a lot of parameters here that I set up to allow me to massage the generation of the island to actually make it look nice, for using things like weights for picking which kinds of tiles to generate, so I can customize how the rivers and grasses spawn. You can stick around to just see how nice and polished I get this in a little bit. As mentioned in my previous video on the Godot Unity drama, I wanted to spend some more time in Blender, so I spent a lot of time this week making little tweaks to the tiles. I really like how they all came out. On top of that, I worked on building some basic building UI, a selection of different tiles, cursor modes for building, selecting, and free clicking. I started using Freya's shapes assets to draw this neat little cursor, which looks amazing. Okay. You're not going to believe what I did with it. I then set up a basic camera, which actually, this ties us back into point 3, which is do not hard commit and polish anything until you are positive it'll be needed. You'll see this time and time again in this video, and you can count how many times I remark that I'm going to change something later. So now that we got the initial generation and a layout to build on, spend the last week of month 1 to complete some basic components for the MVP, and that's business person speak for minimum viable product. Using the shapes asset again, I'm now able to draw a grid to properly show where the tiles are. I did a little refactoring so that I can squish any object. Look at the farms, they're so pretty. I did more refactoring of the grid to use meshes instead of prefab, so it's super lightweight and generates way faster now. Also made a lot of underlying code changes, like distributing calculations across multiple threads so that now the generation doesn't brick my PC for a second anytime I want to regen the terrain. I then created some meshes for points, drawing dashed lines around the tiles and points, so now they're split into both quad and point tiles. I can build buildings on either the full quads or just on the little points that connect them. I did this because I disliked how goofy the scaling can sometimes be in these games where the buildings are the same size as a farm, even though one should be significantly larger than, say, a windmill that's in the middle of it. I also set up some initial tower defense scripts, a save system, submesh changes to allow multiple materials on the tile, so now we can have this chill grass shader. Looks so sick, hell yeah. Made some basic logic for the enemies so they now spawn and attack targets, and oh man, I love looking at these commit messages. Also, I had to set up an archer tower system. Arrows have a little particle system trail and adding animations to the enemies. To wrap up, I polished the camera near 100% since I know I'm going to use this. I was wrong. Do not do this. I also set up some basic economy systems for getting gold for slaying enemies and costing gold to build towers. So, end of month 1, a report. Goals are mostly met. I got the core hook done, the procedural generation of the island, but there's still so much to do on the actual gameplay. So month 2, we're going to jump right back into where we left off, making an edge grid for placing castle walls along the edges. I made 3 different lengths of walls in Blender, and depending on how big the gap is, I choose one of the 3 to put there. Yes, using splines would have probably been more efficient and probably looked better, but again, we are under a time crunch. Good, not great is going to be my mantra from here on out. Also, our island is seriously lacking in terms of any sort of visual uniqueness, so just to prevent my eyes from bleeding, I generated trees from yet another noise map. So these are little dots. I'm not spawning them on river tiles, and I actually went back and refactored this to just prevent them from spawning on the rivers themselves, as 2 months later I wound up adding this whole scatter terrain system. But hey, we're getting ahead of ourselves. So I wanted there to be enough of a visual distinction between forest tiles and non-forest tiles, yet still keep some of the organic shape from the noise map. So after adding a whole bunch of logic, I'm pretty happy with this middle ground result that we've got going on here. Vibes are good. Also, placing walls now removes any trees that are in the way by checking for distance. There's no physical colliders on the trees because I'm really trying to keep performance in the back of my mind every day. I want this to be able to run on just about any sort of laptop or PC. So I also wrapped up the generation by adding some of these mines, some hills, polished the trees a bit, use this neat little wind shader. Then added a bit of path generation, making sure it worked in harmony with our river generation system. That was a nightmare and a half. I went on a deep dive into AI pathing the following week, but before I did that, I spent some time on adding outlines to the towers when you mouse over them. Also added some basic tiles and building selection UI and a little bit of juice when placing a building. In order to do this, I had to build out a basic audio system for the game. Also, I added some little indicators when you're mousing over UI, clicking buttons, etc. Just little audio tweaks. Updated the tower range indicators with a shader, wound up changing this later. Point 3 again, remember, no polish. After this, I took a deep dive into AI pathing and path generation. So we're moving back to the scope discussion here for a minute. Cozy city builder, tower defense roguelike game is a lot of different genres and a lot to get right. So I'm going to scale back on the city building aspects for now. I looked at the scope and I saw that having to deal with enemies navigating across different tiles and types across the rivers, it was just going to be a total pain in the ass to try to set up. How are they going to deal with trees? What about walls? This doesn't mean I'm not going to add it later, but let's keep the scope small to start. We can always add complex features once it's complete. Instead of moving across the tiles, let's have our enemies just run it down mid like my Yasuo that just hit his O10 power spike. And by the way, this was a blasted code. Basically, I start at the endpoint and branch out, taking note of which tiles I hit. Each color ball here represents a different path, and if the path doesn't make it to the end of the island, I throw away the whole island and start again. So eventually I got it to a point that looks pretty good. This is like 30 hours of coding in one sentence. I am deceased. So here's some little dudes running on it. Next was more visual polish and improving a lot of the basic systems. I did some scene setup to load from the title screen to an island generation scene. All just sort of back-end stuff that we're going to need for the game. And we're going to allow the players to generate the island that they will play on themselves, then jump right into the game. There will be a lot of polish on this front in the future, but for now, let's start talking about the enemies. So for week 3 of this month, I started work on the Goblin Horde. Originally, when thinking about this project, I considered using Unity's DOT/ECS tech stack. It's such a cool system, and I spent some time messing around with it over the summer. But the question is, should I work on that now or later? It would be a nice way to cap off month 2, but ultimately I decided I need to make a fun game first, then I can worry about cool tech decisions later. Might do an entire video on this in the future if I wind up getting to it. If I don't, then I won't. This is just going to be something that I'll determine later, which draws us back into point 2. Point 2 is to focus the f*** up. You can always add complex features once the game's complete, but for now, we need to focus on the core features that are needed. Also for me, it just means no YouTube devlogs. I'm doing a little posting on Twitter if you guys want to see what I'm doing on like a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. Mostly just goblin mode coding in my room. Next thing I needed to add was a time system, because I hate how with some games like Rogue Tower or Kingdom Rush, you wind up just alt-tabbing and watching YouTube videos because you've got these long down times where the enemies are not getting past all of that and you don't really have to pay attention. So I worked on a pause, play, fast forward system, and it does that. Pause menu actually looks pretty fire with this little spinny effect. And after that, I worked on adding more towers, some arrows shooting that flies in arcs, added a depth of field effect that looks okay, but it's kind of cheap and it needs a lot of work. But learning from past mistakes, I'm not going to worry about it. It's good enough for now. The polish will arrive later. Also worked on some mesh generation magic to generate a nav mesh only along the paths for the little dudes to walk on. There's this great asset for horde movement that works for both ECS and game objects that I'll be utilizing to make little mangs more performant. Thank you, Mr. Turbo, for showing me the light here. And they can run on nav meshes, so that's a thing. Anyway, it's time to work on the towers, so I did 3 basic tower types: Archer, Artillery, and Mage. I have an idea for setting up proper D&D classes eventually, but that's going to be on the I get to it when I get to it kind of vibe. So this was cool though to sit down and plot out on paper to experiment with a few different styles before eventually throwing most of it out and starting with these 3 base ones. I know swordsmen were critical to Kingdom Rush, but they would be pretty complicated, so I didn't want to add them from the start. I bought these really nice looking tower defense assets as a bit of a reward to myself for working at this for 2 months straight. This is actually the first asset I've bought for the project, and I think it's definitely worth the price. And this is where I add the caveat that buying an occasional asset that complements your skill set can be super worthwhile. An asset for a save system, like, no, I can code that myself. I'm trying to spend money intelligently on assets, and I think in total, the grass I got on sale for $5, Magica cloth I got for like $10, these little goblin dudes I got maybe $10 or $15 on sale, plus these new ones were $40. And can I make $40 in 4 hours at McDonald's? Yes. Can I spend 4 hours in Blender and make something that looks better than all this? No. If you can model it, then by all means knock it out yourself. I cannot. So in my opinion, totally worthwhile pickup. Hey, it's starting to look like an actual game, which is just in time because we are hitting month 3. Now, I've combined the first 2 weeks of this month into one segment because there's just so many interacting systems that had to be built that all interacted with each other. First thing I added was a somewhat balanced economy system that pays out when you kill enemies. This money can be spent on things like towers and upgrades. I also wanted to make this a roguelike, so I added a card draw feature. But how would cards be drawn? Would there be a shop to buy them from? Not really sure. The best way to set this up was going to be the route of vampire survivors and add an experience bar. Once you slay enough enemies, the bar will go up and a card panel will pop up. And now to do this, I had to make an entire experience system, and to do that, I needed to see which cards the player had access to, so I had to do a whole ass meta progression system, so more work on the save data, because now I needed to add a meta progression currency, and those cards need to apply global modifiers to things like towers, so I had to build out a whole global modifier system. Okay, let's break this down. So there are meta progression cards that the player can unlock. These will give in-game bonuses such as increasing tower range or adding poison damage. Lots and lots of possibilities. There's going to be 2 types of these. one that only lasts till the end of the game, and ones that are permanent upgrades. These permanent upgrades will be applied every run, so the player buys them, they feel like they're making small incremental progress from all their hard work, where the in-game ones will allow the player to pick specific synergies and card combos to maybe try a run focusing all on archers, or try a run focusing on artillery. These in-game cards will show up every level in the game, so the player gets a choice in how each run will progress. Now, to purchase new cards, the player will need a new meta currency, which I have affectionately called Cloudstone Relics. At the end of the game, you are paid out a bit based on how many waves you survived, thus rewarding the player for doing a good job. Look at you. Then I got one comment in Discord saying, oh, by the way, join the Discord if you want to playtest the game right now. But the one comment said, didn't Kingdom Rush have barracks? So yeah, I had to add it, but I'm glad I did. Basic building has a few friendly little guys that spawn from it. They run out and fight your enemies, and we're going to need a rally point where the troops spawn from. This gets auto-generated when the building is placed. It just finds a point on the path nearby, and we do a little ray cast down, a bada bing, a bada boom, we're good to go. It's also going to need to be configurable so that the player can reposition the troops to fight enemies. There's really basic logic here that allows the units to see each other, damage each other, play little animations. It's really janky at the moment, but if I do wind up going with dots or ECS later and I have to completely rewrite this, yeah, it kind of looks like sheep, but it's good enough for now. Also set up some tower tiered upgrades and redid a good chunk of the UI for the towers. This shows the upgrades that the player can purchase, allows for selling or repositioning the rally point if it's barracks. Also redid the range indicators, really loving the look of it now. Capped off with some more basic UI, and now I feel like we've got an actual game going on here. And speaking of actual game, you can wishlist it on Steam, because for week 3, I updated the Steam page and playtest page. I also rewrote an old script to automate uploading builds to Steam, so this week was blocked out as an empty week for balancing, but there's just so many systems that still needed work, and all the videos I've been uploading to Twitter, I know it's X, I don't care, it's just whatever. I just had something like Sleep Token or some other music playing over in the background. So now that I'm playing the game on Steam, I realized it was very quiet. So I added some audio cues to things like hits, button clicks, and made this really nice dynamic background music system that would fade in and out from a peaceful vibe to more battle tracks when the enemies start spawning. There's also now a settings menu for setting audio volume levels, which took forever to make, but if I uploaded it to Steam without some sort of audio settings, I'd be swimming with the fishes. Audio is also set to 50% on first load. I don't know why games always have it set to 100, it makes my ears bleed. I also spent some time fixing Steam build to a working gameplay loop with lots and lots of miscellaneous fixes. For example, I now use white or red text to indicate if you have enough money to purchase an upgrade, or say I have an experience system, which works great. I have an audio system, which works great. I have a leveling up system, pause system, etc. But combine them all, and then there's sometimes a weird bug that I gotta fix. Also, getting feedback on Twitter, I was told that the font reminded them of Comic Sans, which I kind of agree. So I switched to a new one. What do you guys think? UI also got a major facelift thanks to the free assets from the god himself. This guy makes so many incredible free assets. I don't know how to thank him other than donating and sending you guys his way. Finally added a bit of polish to the terrain generation, adding some additional parameters so the player can customize the generation of their island to their liking. Scattered terrain has also been added to break up the grass a bit. Cheap. And finally, for the last week, I got around to adding more enemy types. It was so easy since all the underlying systems were already there. All I had to do was add a few more stats on top of an already built systems, and make a few minor changes to things like enemy logic, since I waited until it was mostly figured out at this point, which I think was a pretty good call. Some enemies will have higher magic resist, some will walk slower and have more health. I like to add more unique abilities, the shaman should have little buffs to their contemporaries, but we'll add that later. Also, island generation parameters integrated into the UI, gold awarded for calling waves early, seeds actually finally work, Lamau. Lots of miscellaneous island procedural generation improvements, major fixes for EXP system, music, health bars, projectiles, added 7 new enemy types, refactored enemy spawning logic, bestiary panel, look, it shows all the dudes, my dudes, cleaned up the title screen a bit, enemy pop-up UI on new enemy sighting, pause screens refactoring, fixed fast respawning during pause. After playtesting a bit, I realized it was really missing the spell things from Kingdom Rush, so just had to add those two. And first being reinforcements, you can summon them and they spawn anywhere. They fight a little bit and disappear after 30 seconds or something. Also Meteor Rain. And I recorded a proper trailer for Steam. It includes some of the stuff from month 4, but let's call it a sneak preview. Thanks for sticking till the end. So finally, point number 1, fail. Okay, schizo rant warning, but to be mildly vulnerable for a moment and to give you an answer as to why I've moved to the current project. Let's say I quit my job and worked on Tavern Team full time. Might get it done in a year or two. What happens if it only makes 20K? I give up 1 to 2 years of income as a software dev for what? Same with Tourney Manager. Sure, it might sell more, but I don't know that. Nothing is guaranteed. What if I don't quit my job and just give up my free time for 4 years and it doesn't work out? What's the point? Wasted life. It sucks to drop something I spent so much time on, but I'd rather drop it now than spend several years on it and then go cry on Reddit with a post-mortem about how it didn't pan out. The Cave game was an attempt to make something that would blow up on YouTube, a horror, multiplayer, roguelike, stupidly overscoped, would take me years to finish. Now the current tower defense game has a hard deadline of 6 months. I know I can finish it. I know it'll sell well. I know how I want to market it. I know the price range. I'm super confident, and I also want to get a game released. After that, who knows? Maybe stick to a 6-month scope, maybe drop it to 3, or spend another 3 months supporting it with updates. I had wildly overscoped those previous projects because I didn't understand just how much work it was. There were 100 people telling me to start with a smaller project, and I should have listened. I don't know if you're going to listen to me, but I do know if you don't eventually, you'll learn just as I did. I've learned so much through the past projects that moving to this new one doesn't feel like I'm starting over. There's this good quote by Alex Hormozy. I think it's along the lines of, it doesn't matter how fast you row, it matters what kind of boat you're rowing in. But I wrote this godforsaken script for a video. There's still so much I want to add, like relics, a shop that shows up like the dude from The Legend of Zelda, seasons, sunsets, weather conditions. If you want to see any of this, you can subscribe. I just want to get back to coding. But you can go wishlist the game right now on Steam, join my Discord to hang out and play the playtest. The entire game so far, completely for free.